The presentation I'm going to give is going to be a little bit different to Jean-Paul and Joan's in terms of being more empirical in orientation, but hopefully you'll be able to see, certainly I have connections and points being developed and picked up between them. So I should say that the research I'm going to talk about was funded by the Royal Geographical Society with the Institute of British Geographers in the UK, and what I'm presenting is a shorter version of a paper which was just published last week in the journal Environment and Planning A. So if anyone wants to see that, there's a link. It's a pay-to-access journal. I'm happy to email copies if anyone wants to see it and doesn't have access. So in broad terms, I want to talk about the intersections between hospitality, ambiences and atmospheres, mobility, and infrastructure. I'll do so by considering how both hospitable and inhospitable ambiences and atmospheres emerge within the context of mobility and commuter travel, specifically when it comes to cycling and various forms of cycling infrastructure. So I'm going to focus on this felt sense of the social and material environment that cyclists move through. So thinking about how ambiences and atmospheres emerge from relations between cyclist bodies, other mobile bodies, the broader space, its design, societal contexts, and also non-human forms of materiality, entities and objects. In thinking about that, I'm going to look particularly at shared forms of transport infrastructure and how these can choreograph bodies and their movements through the city. And I'll suggest that that infrastructure and such choreography can be usefully reflected on through the lens of ambiences or atmospheres. This doesn't tend to be the way that the evaluation of infrastructure takes place, certainly in the UK, and is not common practice. So effectively, I'm interested in how transport infrastructure can contribute towards the co-production of various either hospitable or inhospitable atmospheres and ambiences between differently mobile bodies, and with that, how feelings of inclusion or being out of place can emerge for certain types of mobility. In many cases, what I'm going to be talking about is going to be about inhospitality rather than hospitable spaces. So it's a lot of it's about design failures rather than about positive outcomes. But this probably isn't all that surprising because it's often when such failures occur and such negative atmospheres emerge that they start to be felt most intensely. So there's a bit of a parallel with the kind of things that Stephen Graham's written about infrastructure, that it only tends to be noticed when it fails. In this context, the atmospheres and ambiences that these cyclists encounters tended to emerge and become most pointed when they were negative and when infrastructure in somehow staged or contributed towards that. And to preempt my conclusions a little bit, ultimately I'm going to be arguing that such felt experiences of hospitality or inhospitality could be considered further when it comes to planning for sustainable types of transport like cycling and when evaluating the infrastructures that are installed and trying to encourage that practice. Such a perspective to me provides a useful and expanded knowledge base from which such planning for transport could become embedded, and it would be more attentive to the actual lived experiences of these spaces, or certainly more attentive than a lot of the practice that currently takes place in the UK at least. So ultimately it's about how that might help contribute towards the production of more inclusive or hospitable feelings within public spaces. I'm conscious that the talks from Jean-Paul and Joan before have been quite conceptual orientation, so as I said, I'm going to be taking a more empirical contrast to that. There are a couple of points of conceptual clarification that I want to pick up on, but I'm going to try and do that very quickly, especially how things are for time, so I'll just go through this very quickly. One thing that you'll have noticed so far, perhaps, is that I've been stumbling across the words ambience and atmospheres, using them together, and Jean-Paul mentioned this. I don't really want to get into that as a technical distinction too much, other than to say the work that I'm grounded in comes largely from UK or Anglophone scholarship that talks about atmospheres, and there is a distinction in some senses between the type of work that Jean-Paul's been involved in and doing and developing and was talking about. There's a lot in common between them, so interests in sensory experience, shared sensory experience, the tone of a space or an environment, how that can hold a tone, how such tones can be shaped by design practice, amongst other things. And there are some subtle points of difference, but I don't think we need to get bogged down in that. So really for my talk, I'm going to use atmospheres to try and cut down on me stumbling over these words. And what I'm referring to with atmospheres, what I'm referring to by that is largely summed up by the couple of quotes on the slide there. So it's the idea that spaces can have some kind of background feel or tone or quality that is present but not easily tangible, and it's not necessarily easily described, captured, represented. So we'll be referring to what Derek McCormack describes as a felt quality of environmental immersion that registers in and through sensing bodies while also remaining diffuse in the air ethereal. Or in other terms, to use Kathleen Stewart's work, that an atmosphere is some kind of force field in which people find themselves. And it's important to say that that can be more or less forceful, more or less subtle, and it can impinge in different ways. Another key term that I should briefly just clarify is I'm going to be talking about infrastructure as well, but I'm not going to be talking about that as an engineer might. I'm not talking about it in technical terms and in technical detail. I'm not an engineer. Oddly, I'm in a faculty of science and engineering, and I'm neither a scientist nor an engineer. So, but I'm going to be talking about that for its social and experiential qualities rather than the technical side of things. So how that can contribute towards shape, coordinate certain types of experience. And again, there's a range of work that I'm drawing on here that's looked at this. So people like Asha Min have talked about the ways in which atmospheres can generate what he calls distinctive public feelings, or as Tonkis suggests in a little bit more detail, infrastructure brokers interactions between people, between things, between people and things, and with that it shapes a larger environment that supports, secures and segments those interactions. So it's something that's experienced. And the final term I just want to briefly mention is that I'll be talking about in terms of co-production. So the focus here is not necessarily just on the cyclists, it's not just on the infrastructure, but it's looking at how relations, social relations between bodies, materialities, practices, contexts, cultures come together in generating those atmospheres, and it's not coming from one single source. It's more distributed in that way. The agency is distributed amongst these contexts. So that's the general theory for today. I'm going to move on from that now. The project that I'm going to talk about, I'll say a little bit about its background and the research that involves so you can understand where I'm coming from in talking about these themes. But the project was undertaken in Plymouth in the UK, and for those of you who aren't aware, Plymouth's in the far southwest of England on the coast, and it's a fairly small city, has a population of about 250,000 people. Sadly, 60% of them voted for Brexit. This is when I clarify I'm Scottish, which feels like it means something at the moment, and I'm tempted to move back. But the research itself involved 24 commuter cyclists, 13 men, 11 women of varying age. It was ranged from 25 to 60, I think, and with varying degrees of experience and confidence when it came to cycling. I also interviewed transport planners from the local council and members of cycling advocacy groups, but I'm going to focus on the discussions with the cyclists today. With these cyclists, I undertook what I'd call video interviews. So I gave them a head cam, which they strapped onto their helmet, or if they didn't wear one, a fetching headband. And they would go out with that and cycle their commuting journeys several times, and generally generated about an hour's worth of video. I then took that video, watched it, and generated for each participant a different interview, effectively, which was based around the experiences that they'd had in the video. And we then sat down, with not all of their video, but some of their video, talked through it, discussed it for an hour, hour and a half. So it was a fairly small-scale project, but intensive engagement with the participants. And the idea of that was a lot of the time there's a risk in these kind of contexts of hearing about the kind of big headlines, the grand stories, the overly significant events of near misses with traffic and so on. And what I wanted to try and get at was more of the routine, everyday, banal encounters that they had that made up the majority of their experiences, not the big headlines and standout notable events, the much more banal, subtle, everyday encounters. Before turning to some of those encounters and trying to suggest how they might be interesting in thinking about atmospheres and ambiences and thinking about hospitality and inclusion, I should probably say a little bit more about the case study context, because certainly coming over to continental Europe, it's a very different world when it comes to cycling, cycling infrastructure, cycling cultures. So Plymouth's an interesting context in the UK to think about the relationship between cycling infrastructure and experience in a number of ways. It should be quite a suitable city for cycling. It's quite hilly, it's on the southwest coast, so it's quite wet. But it's also a compact city. From the city centre to the furthest suburbs, it's only about 7 miles, and it's a slightly oddly shaped city in that below Plymouth on the map is actually, that's where the centre is, and it's, if you take the Burgess concentric ring model, it's like it's been cut in half because the sea got in the way. So it's a kind of semicircular city in that way. And a lot of the key employers within the city are close to or right next to major residential areas. So there's a lot of housing around the universities, a large hospital, the local council, and so on. So it should be quite easy to cycle. However, like much of the UK, there's very little provision for cycling, which is largely a product of the limited visibility of cycling within post-World War II urban redevelopment and the growing emphasis that placed on motoring. So the centre of Plymouth was very badly bombed during the World War II. There's now a very large range of ugly, modernist, what at one time would have been quite grand, but are now quite dilapidated concrete buildings. There are some wide streets, but there's also some old Victorian, Edwardian, winding, narrow streets. A lot of that legacy is that Plymouth cycling infrastructure is quite piecemeal, and it tends to be just standardised things that have been imposed regardless of any kind of local context. There's some short on-road cycle lanes. Increasingly, there are more shared spaces, so sharing lanes with buses or sharing pavements with pedestrians. But basically, there's been fairly limited investment in such facilities for some time, and where it has been imposed, it's often of questionable usage. You know, you get 12 metres of cycle path and then it stops. You get that kind of pointless thing, but on a spreadsheet, when you add all those 12 metres together, it looks really good. So cycling participation rates in the city are quite low. They are at about the UK national average, but that's not really saying much. And there's a fairly limited culture of cycling. A lot of people use cars. Congestion can be quite bad in key areas, meaning certain central areas have relatively low air quality, although the windiness on the coast tends to help a little with that. And it tends to mean that cyclists aren't encountered all that often. And if they are, it's not generally any kind of critical mass of numbers. And as I'll try and show, this kind of context of limited presence, limited status is quite significant when it comes to the feelings of hospitality or inhospitality that emerge in cyclist interactions with others in using the infrastructure that is there. So with that general context in mind, I want to talk now a little bit about some of these experiences that emerged in my discussions with these cyclists and how that tied into themes around hospitality, inhospitality, and how those shared collective feelings around that. So very generally, the infrastructure in Plymouth for cycling tends to bring together differently mobile bodies into the same space, moving at differing degrees of speed or slowness, moving along slightly different trajectories, and that leads to various atmospheres finding consistency, even if for a short time, between these mobile bodies. So for example, interactions with various forms of motor vehicle are clearly significant in generating certain types of atmosphere here. And the way that road infrastructure coordinated those interactions, the degree to which that infrastructure or codifications were observed, amongst a range of other factors. So in Kathleen Stewart's words, such roads acted as charge compositions of bodies, rhythms, orientations, and atmospheres. And you can see on the slide one of these relatively charged compositions. This is from a cyclist who spoke to where shortly before this screen grab was taken, the car that had been passing them passed very, very close, even though it's actually a dual carriageway. It was early in the morning, there's no traffic. The wing mirror of the car very nearly clipped the handlebar of the cyclist. And as you can see, that produced, at best, mixed feelings for the cyclist in terms of how hospitable that space felt for them. And that wasn't always the case. So some cyclists noticed that infrastructure was fine in these kind of contexts, that motorists were fine, that space was given, standing was recognized, and variously, I guess, convivial interactions took place. But also there was suggestions that there was infrastructure that, by its very design, produced these kinds of confrontations. So often traffic calming measures, an island in the middle of a road to help pedestrians cross would create a pinch point, which would mean as a car came to pass, they'd reach the island, they'd either have to slam the brakes on, cut the person up, and so on. So you'd have these kinds of infrastructure that just tended to, by their very nature, stage some kind of tension. But interestingly, it wasn't so much these interactions with motor vehicles that were most prominent in the discussions. It was actually where spaces were shared with pedestrians that the strongest sense of inhospitality emerged here. And that's significant in that increasingly in the city, there is a move towards converting pedestrian spaces into shared spaces. So that is something that is coming out more and more. So for the remainder of my talk, I want to look at this shared space context and where cyclists share space with pedestrians. And in part, this emerges from a broader narrative in transport planning around shared space design. So it's something that largely emerged in continental Europe in the late 20th century as a key transport planning agenda and practice, and it's something in recent years in the UK everybody's got quite excited about and decided that this is the right thing to do and the way to go. So shared space planning effectively entails the removal of symbolic and material demarcations between pedestrians and other traffic. So connecting back to Jean's talk, it's literally nothing much more than removing the symbolic and the material distinctions and the idea that forms of hospitable interaction, inclusive interaction will result. And as a result of that, it's claimed that it places emphasis on informal protocols and negotiation, and that it reintroduces the sorts of challenges and unpredictable movements of mixed traffic which existed for centuries before more familiar segregation was in place. And for its advocates, this kind of transport planning represents an important step towards widening opportunities for communities and individuals to shape and influence the built environment in ways that encourage diversity, distinctiveness, urban quality, and civility, so themes that are obviously very relevant to today. And ultimately, it's thought to be something that might lead to more inclusive experiences of the city. It's also been suggested, though, that the evidence base for those claims isn't necessarily clearly established. It's generally just presented as common sense because of how well it's worked elsewhere, and there's perhaps a lack of attention to the different ways in which individuals might experience it. So Rob Imrie's talked about the visually impaired and how they might be situated when certain material demarcations are removed. If they don't have curbs to recognise where a road is and where traffic might be, they don't know where crossings are, etc., it becomes a challenge. And there's a risk of a slight sort of cookie cutter mentality here of it's worked elsewhere, so we're just going to drop it in here, standardised, and everything's going to work fine. It doesn't necessarily pay attention to the context it's being imposed upon. So the cycling infrastructure I'm going to focus on, and the examples I'll get to in a moment, isn't entirely shared, in that generally it's not all modes sharing the same space. It's about cyclists and pedestrians and other kinds of foot traffic. And it generally is the case that there's a demarcation maintained for motor vehicles. Largely so that they're not disrupted. and it's cheaper to paint a stripe down the middle of a pavement than it is to get rid of much more grand-scale infrastructure. So there's a clear logic underlying the installation of this kind of infrastructure. It's relatively inexpensive, allows provision for cycling-specific infrastructure in spaces where there's limited space or capacity, and it doesn't disrupt existing road networks. But as you might expect, taking cyclists off the road and dumping them on a pavement, on a sidewalk shared with pedestrians, doesn't necessarily lead to dispositions emerging that are the kind of thing you'd hope for or want. So pedestrians might not feel all that happy about cyclists being on the pavement, and cyclists might end up not enjoying that experience of being there because of that. So one of the things that I'm going to talk through now is that a lot of the cyclists I spoke to found that the intentions of shared space planning didn't pan out in the reality of their experiences of being on the move. The agendas behind it didn't necessarily emerge. The sorts of informal social protocols or actively considered negotiations that are suggested to emerge hadn't. Part of that might be time. It's a relatively recent intervention. It's been ongoing for the past 5 or 6 years, but it's not necessarily, there's not a lot being done to encourage that embedding either. So I want to take you through a few examples from the research that I've completed here that show how various hospitable and inhospitable atmospheres can emerge in the sharing of these spaces. And I'll just go straight to the example. You can see here one of the shared infrastructures I'm talking about. So this used to just be a pavement that was for pedestrians only, but as you can see on the left-hand image, there is some symbols painted on the ground to suggest that it's no longer just a pavement. That's basically the extent of the intervention on infrastructure here. And in these two images, you can see in the first one, there's a bus pulled up and there's a guy got off the bus and is walking towards those symbols, towards the cyclist. And as they meet shortly after those symbols, the pedestrian looks up at the cyclist, and you can't quite see this a relatively grainy image from the camera, that they muttered something, but there was definitely something said and a look exchanged. In the interview with the cyclist, they noted that there is clearly a sign there which says it's a shared lane, but you get that, don't you, where pedestrians feel that you shouldn't be on the pavement and they might sort of glare at you like this person has. And it's easy to read a lot into these kinds of small-scale events and potentially overstep that reading, but this did seem to have something significant for this cyclist and other cyclists I spoke to in terms of how significant it was for the production of a certain atmosphere between cyclists and pedestrians here. So it was rare that overt acts of aggression would generally take place, but it was more these subtle acts of malcontent. So the kind of things that Jean-Paul talked about in terms of, at the level of the gestural rather than anything grander, or to slightly reappropriate a phrase from Joan, that's rather than civil inattention, it's almost uncivil inattention. It's not in sustained engagement, but it's not civil either. So it's about pointed looks, shaken heads. Those kinds of gestures bring around this feeling of unease or of being judged that tends to linger, even though they haven't done anything wrong. They're entirely conforming to the transport system that's been laid out for them. And in addition to these formally recognised shared space, some of the participants I spoke to would also cycle on the pavement anyway. A lot of the time this was put down to the inappropriateness of road systems for them to cycle on. So if they were approaching a large roundabout and had to turn right in the UK, so going around several junctions, having to pull out into the middle of traffic and so on, especially if they weren't very confident, there would be times where they just didn't want to cycle on the road because they didn't feel safe. So what tended to happen was some of these cyclists would move onto the pavement, and with that, again, interesting kinds of interaction emerged. They generally did it where they felt it was going to be safe, and did so in a way that would want to try to be sort of recognizing that they were potentially in the wrong here or technically in the wrong, and so wanted to make sure that they behaved in a way that was respectful to the people who had more right to be there. But that still didn't necessarily lead to that being recognized, I guess. So the quote from the slide is from one participant who was talking about a set of images where a woman was one of the slightly more grander interactions in terms of malcontent. Said that, I just don't really know what to say, because this woman, having kind of had a go at her for cycling there, having shouted at her, that she was at the other side of the pavement, they weren't getting in the way of each other, and it's when that happens you kind of have a problem with it, because if they're telling you off out of principle, I know I can appreciate that, but I'm not going to dignify it with a response. If I'm actually knocking over your 3-year-old kid, sure, by all means arrest me, but just to have a go at me for the sake of having a go at me, I'll completely ignore it. So this idea that people on a point of principle would start to engage in negative ways was troubling for these cyclists. So it was generally clear that when these cyclists took to spaces that they technically weren't meant to be in, they would try to behave in a way that avoided conflict. So they would try to kind of negotiate their interactions, negotiate while in motion with the traffic. And some did kind of turn it around a little bit and bemoan the oblivious pedestrians and how kind of ignorant of cyclists they could be. It was generally recognized that because cycling is relatively low in prominence or visibility in the city, that they couldn't really get on too much of a high horse in that context. Yeah, great. So what I want to do now is just take you through a few examples of how these interactions were negotiated by these cyclists, where there was potential for negative interactions to take place, and how they tried to navigate space shared with pedestrians in convivial ways. A lot of the time that would be something as simple as translating into the speeds they would cycle at and recognizing that they were going to have to give up some of the momentum or speed. So just very quickly, this sequence of images on the slide. At the top left, you can see this is Armada Way, which is a major shopping street in the centre of Plymouth that's part of the post-war regeneration, so it's actually very, very wide. But here there's a Christmas market down the middle, which has taken up a lot of the space. So moving down the left-hand side of this market, the cyclist hits a group of pedestrians. They slow right down. They have squeaky brakes, so their subtle attempt to try and make them aware of their presence was to brake, let them squeak. Didn't notice the presence and thought, okay, well, I'm not going to try and push this. Sat behind them, and once a space opened up that was safe for them to move into, they pulled into and went off into a slightly quieter area of the market to carry on. So it would be little things like that where they would just engage in, again, subtle gestures of trying to acknowledge their presence, but also not belabor any kind of sense of get out of my way. And sometimes that extended to further things. So the quote on the slide was one of the participants who had an interesting take on it, of when people start to get annoyed, her approach was to kind of fight fire with fire, of pull silly faces and grin and wave and be overly enthusiastic in them saying thank you, just to try to stop these kinds of unnecessary tensions to get any kind of consistency or to take hold. One thing that's mentioned in that quote is the use of a bell, which, again, focusing on really quite small-scale, banal encounters is actually quite significant here, because you would think that a bell would be a useful thing in helping these negotiations, but it actually turned out to be quite a point of contention, which many cyclists stopped using bells precisely because of the negative reactions they got. Largely because of it felt like there was something too insistent about the tone. So again, it's the subtle sonic qualities of it. Rather than someone saying, excuse me, the ring, ring, ring was something that just impinged too much. So it's interesting, there's a slightly counterintuitive set of examples that I want to show, which take two approaches to navigating the same space. So this is moving east out of the city towards one of the residential suburbs. And again, it's one of those, a pavement that at some points has some signs on it saying cyclists are sharing it with pedestrians. There's no division of the space into two sides. There's nothing formal. It's just the idea that people will work their way through it. And in this slide, in the top left image, there's a cyclist approaching two pedestrians who are walking along. At the top right image, they've rung the bell. One of them turns round in a start, in a kind of, abruptly stops and looks round. And the second pedestrian didn't do anything, so the bell was rung again, and they start to kind of stumble round in a not really being aware, wondering what's going on sort of way. And with that, you can't quite see it here, but as they turned round, rather than looking over one shoulder, they turned and stepped out into the way of the cyclist more. So that meant the cyclist had to slam the brakes on, having been moving at a reasonable speed. There was apologies exchanged, or however sincere, I don't know, and then they moved on around it. So it was something as simple as trying to just cycle down here when it's not congested, it's just two pedestrians, produce this kind of interaction where those people surprised, interrupted, not know what's going on. This example is just a little bit further back up the road, where a cyclist took a different approach. So here again, the top left, they're approaching a pedestrian, this time a single pedestrian who's running, and rather than ring a bell, which they had a bell on their bike, they just don't use it, they shouted out, passing on your left to the runner. And you can see in the final image that the pedestrian has moved slightly further in, or that the runner looks over their shoulder, smiles and says thanks as the cyclist goes by. So there's much more of a humane form of interaction in a way of speaking rather than ringing bells. So just as a penultimate slide, so I think I'm good for time, there was a few things of a few points of broader reflection that come out from this. Obviously, I don't want to go too far because it's one case study, it's a series of very specific microscale interactions, but one of the key points that came out was, in a way, the feeling of labour that cyclists ended up with when it came to their interactions with pedestrians. A lot of the time, trying to find appropriate ways or means of negotiating space that they shared with pedestrians involved a lot of effort. So it meant that cyclists had to try to anticipate and get a sense of what was going to happen and act accordingly before it happened. And in a way that ties into some of the shared space literature and the suggestions of what emerges from this. So the idea that people develop a range of anticipatory skills and communication skills that allow them to share space in a convivial way. And you would think that would lead to a more hospitable form of relationship between those using the space. But the cyclists didn't feel that here because largely the perception was that it was all down to them. It was their responsibility, their obligation, it was their effort, it was their burden to try to engage with these pedestrians in a hospitable way. And a lot of the time there was assumptions that pedestrians didn't expect to encounter cyclists. The video that I recorded tend to kind of confirm that a lot of the time there was surprise or not expectation. And while the cyclists became attuned to what pedestrians might do, it still wasn't, it wasn't a positive outcome. It was a necessity rather than a positive thing. And counterintuitively, that actually led quite a lot of cyclists to stop using such infrastructure. While being on pavements would in all statistical senses lead to safer journeys, there's less likely for accident, there's less likelihood for severe accident because of what they would actually bump into. A lot of them felt less anxious being amongst traffic because there was fewer permutations of what traffic would do, because generally most of the cyclists were also motorists. They would understand what motorists were meant to do, and they could anticipate that more easily. So while it might mean being stuck between a motorbike and a bus in a middle lane on a busy road, actually they were happier there because they knew that that bus was not going to cut them up. They could see the motorbike, they'd position themselves that the bus could see them, and so on and so on. So they were basically cycling as motorists was the outcome. So while shared spaces are meant to produce feelings of hospitality, here it actually pushed people out of the infrastructure. So just to conclude in 2 minutes then, there's a couple of points I just want to finish with. So hopefully my presentation has given a sense of some of the ways in which cyclists gained a sense of the environments they moved through by focusing on the atmospheres that emerged and were felt by these cyclists, particularly focusing on these shared forms of transport infrastructure. That infrastructure acted to choreograph bodies in more specific or more vague ways, and so through that contributed towards the production of certain social relations and so atmospheres between these bodies. While these could or were hoped to lead towards hospitality, and inclusive spaces, it tended to not. So one of the things I'd suggest here is that when thinking about such mobility, and doing so in terms of atmosphere, it might be a useful alternative to start to think about transport planning in a different way and using different registers of knowledge towards that. So atmospheres here seem to be significant towards, or significant in these cyclists' experiences. However, they're not something that's used routinely when it comes to transport planning practice, certainly not in the UK in general, and certainly not in the Plymouth context. We are starting to increasingly get more reference to, in transport planning in the UK, things like the need for better streets that are civilised places. So that's from the Department for Transport's recent publications. However, the way that's being pursued tends to fall back onto fairly standard forms of infrastructure and fairly standard measures of its success, usage figures, meterage of infrastructure implemented, the volume of money spent, and so on. And while in places like London, where there's been a ridiculous change and a substantial investment in a whole range of things, that might work. In places where there's relatively low participation, like Plymouth, relatively low funding, like Plymouth, there might be different things that could start to be looked at. So what I'm suggesting is that perhaps such experience in atmosphere should come to be the target of planning and infrastructure development, and particularly their evaluation, as much as manifold or manifest changes in the materiality of transport systems, quantifications of participation, and so on. It's certainly not straightforward to design atmospheres, as we've held throughout today in a whole range of contexts. It's something that the atmospheres and ambiences literature talks about at length. But that isn't to say that expanding the way such planning is thought about isn't a worthwhile experiment. So it might start to help with the development of infrastructure that not just tries and fails to encourage certain practice, it might also help planners and designers to produce spaces that actually stage more hospitable and so inclusive encounters between such differently mobile bodies. I think I'm good for time. Thank you.